When a man came looking for work in the railroad switching yards in the 1880s, the yardmaster did not ask for references. He did not ask for a letter from a previous employer. He did not ask where the man had worked before or how long he had been in the trade or whether he knew the difference between a boxcar and a gondola. He asked the man to hold up his hands. If the applicant had several fingers missing, the yardmaster knew he was an old-timer and would be able to go on the job as an experienced worker. That detail is in the historical record. I found it in a reference published by the Harvey County Historical Society in Kansas, and I have not been able to set it down since I read it. It is the only job interview in American labor history where the qualification for employment was the visible evidence that the job had already maimed you. Missing fingers were the resume. The machine that took them was the credential, and the machine that took them was the link and pin coupler, a device so simple in its design and so catastrophic in its daily operation that it killed and maimed more American railroad workers than any other single piece of equipment in the history of the industry. It operated in every switching yard in the country. It was on every freight car. It required a man to stand between two moving railroad cars and guide a piece of iron into a socket while the cars closed on him from both sides. The men who survived it wore the evidence on their hands for the rest of their lives. The men who did not survive it were listed in the quarterly death journal of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, a publication that ran for pages, issue after issue, name after name, year after year, because the machine kept killing and the railroads kept using it, and the replacement that would have made the killing unnecessary had been sitting in a patent office in Alexandria, Virginia since 1873. For 20 years, in 1890, the Interstate Commerce Commission reported 2,451 railroad workers killed in a single year. Another 22,396 were injured. One death every 3.5 hours. One injury every 23 minutes, around the clock, every day of the year. For the full decade preceding the passage of the Safety Appliance Act of 1893, the Railway Gazette tallied 5,623 railroad worker deaths and 20,445 injuries. In 1893, a trainman working on an American railroad had a 1 in 9 chance of being injured on the job in any given year, and a 1 in 115 chance of being killed. 1 in 9, not 1 in 100, not 1 in 1,000, 1 in 9. Those are not the odds of a workplace accident. Those are the odds of a war. Insurance companies refused to sell life or disability policies to railroad workers. The actuarial tables could not sustain it. The rates of death and permanent injury were so high and so consistent and so predictable that no insurance company in the country would underwrite the risk. The Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen, the union that would later rename itself the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, because the word brakeman no longer described the full range of men who needed its protection, was founded on September 23, 1883, by 8 brakemen sitting in Delaware and Hudson Railway Caboose number 10 in Oneonta, New York. Their wages were just over $1 a day. In the year the union was founded, 33% of all brakemen in the United States were injured on the job, 1 in 3, in a single year. The Brotherhood was not founded to negotiate wages. It was not founded to demand shorter hours. It was founded to create a mutual insurance fund because the men who coupled the nation's freight cars could not buy insurance from anyone else on earth, and they needed a pool of money that would pay their widows and their children when, not if, the machine took them. The Brotherhood's founding purpose was to prepare financially for the deaths that the job guaranteed. I need to explain what the link and pin coupler was and how it operated, because the mechanism is the center of this story and the reason that a man's missing fingers told a yardmaster everything he needed to know. Every railroad car in the United States before 1900 was connected to the car ahead of it and behind it by a coupling device bolted to the end of the car's frame. The link and pin coupler was the standard design for freight service. It consisted of 3 components: a pocket, which was a heavy rectangular iron socket, open at the front and closed at the back, bolted to the drawhead at the end of each car; a link, which was a heavy, oblong iron ring, thick enough to bear the tension of a loaded freight car being pulled by a locomotive roughly 8 to 10 inches long and weighing several pounds. and a pin, which was a heavy iron bolt tapered at the bottom, that dropped through a hole in the top of the pocket to lock the link into place. The link sat in the pocket of one car with its far end extending outward into the gap between the cars. When a second car was pushed toward the first by a switching locomotive, the protruding end of the link was supposed to slide into the pocket of the approaching car. At the precise moment the link seated itself in the second pocket, a man standing between the two cars had to drop the pin through the hole in the top of that pocket, locking the coupling before the link could slip back out. That man was the brakeman. He stood in the gap between the two cars, with the first car stationary at his back and the second car rolling toward him. The locomotive pushing the second car was behind it, often around a curve or several car lengths back, and the engineer at the throttle could not see the brakeman. The brakeman could not see the engineer. There was no signal system, there was no radio, there was no bell or horn protocol. The brakeman stood in the gap holding the link with one hand, guiding its end toward the approaching pocket, holding the pin in his other hand, waiting for the iron to meet the iron. And when the link seated, he dropped the pin and pulled his hands out and stepped sideways out of the gap before the draw heads of the two cars came together and closed the space where his body had been standing. The margin was less than a second. The cars weighed between 20 and 50 tons loaded. They were pushed at walking speed or slightly faster, but walking speed for a 50-ton freight car is enough momentum to crush a human body as completely as the ram of a power press crushes a sheet of steel. The footing was gravel and wooden ties, uneven, often wet, often icy, often covered in coal dust or oil drippings from the cars above. The couplings happened in daylight and in darkness, in summer heat and in January ice storms, in fog and in rain, and in snow that drifted between the cars and turned the rails and the ties into a skating rink where a man's boot could slip at the moment when slipping meant the difference between keeping his hand and losing it. The link itself was heavy and cold and greasy with rail grime, and it had to be held at exactly the right height and angle while a 50-ton car closed the distance at a rate that gave the brakeman no margin for a fumble, a misgrip, a link that bounced instead of seating, a pocket that was slightly misaligned, a car that jolted forward when the locomotive shunted behind it. If the brakeman's timing was right, the link seated, the pin dropped, and he stepped out of the gap with his hands and his body intact. If his timing was off by a fraction of a second, if the link jammed, if the car jolted, if his boot slipped, if he hesitated, the drawheads came together on whatever was between them. The iron did not distinguish between the link and the hand. If his fingers were in the pocket when the drawheads met, he lost the fingers. The iron cut them the way a shear cuts sheet metal, cleanly, quickly, and completely, because the force of a 50-ton car does not need sharp edges to sever flesh and bone. If his hand was in deeper, he lost the hand. If his arm was caught, he lost the arm. If his body was in the gap when the drawheads closed, the two cars crushed him between them and he died there in the yard between the cars, out of sight of the engineer who had been pushing the car and who did not know until someone shouted that the brakeman had not stepped clear. A man who lost fingers went back to work when the stumps healed. He had to. $1 a day was what stood between his family and hunger, and the railroad was the employer, and the railroad did not offer compensation for injuries sustained in the normal course of the work because the legal doctrines of the era held the worker responsible for the hazards he had accepted when he took the job. A man who lost his hand went home and did not return to the railroad. He found other work if he could. A man whose body was caught between the drawheads was buried, and the railroad hired another man, and the next man stepped into the same gap with the same link and the same pin and the same odds, and the coupler continued to operate because it was on every car in the fleet and nobody had required it to be changed. And coupling was only half the danger. The other half was braking. Before the Westinghouse air brake, every freight train in the United States was slowed and stopped by hand brakes. Each car had its own brake, operated by a wheel or a lever mounted on the roof. To slow or stop a train of 20 or 30 or 40 cars, the brakeman had to climb to the top of a moving car, stand on the roof, and turn the brake wheel by hand. Then he had to run to the next car, then the next, then the next. The brakeman worked his way down the length of the train, car by car, leaping from one rooftop to the next, turning the brake wheel on each while the train moved beneath him at speed. The rooftop of a freight car in the 1880s had no railing, no safety line, no guardrail, no handhold beyond whatever grab iron the builder had bolted to the end of the car. The surface was wooden planking, often warped, often split, often coated with ice in winter or rain in any other season, or loose coal dust that had sifted through the seams of the cars below. The cars rocked and swayed on the rail. The coupling between cars allowed several inches of lateral play, which meant that the gap between rooftops shifted as the train moved, widening and narrowing unpredictably. The brakeman leaped across that gap on the run, in the dark, in the rain, at speed, on a surface that was trying to throw him off with every curve and every joint in the rail. If he missed the jump, he fell between the cars and under the wheels. If he lost his footing on the roof, he went over the side and hit the ballast at whatever speed the train was traveling. If the train lurched while he was turning a brake wheel and his grip slipped, he fell. The work was done in all weather, at all hours, on trains that ran around the clock. The head-end brakeman worked the front section of the train. The rear-end brakeman worked the back. At the engineer's signal, both men began running. The train was still moving. The brakes had to be set on every car, one at a time, by hand, on the roof, in the weather, in the dark. The Encyclopedia Britannica's entry on the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen states it plainly. Life expectancy for brakemen quite often was less than 1 year. Due to the precarious rocking and shifting of the boxcars, brakemen frequently inserted themselves between cars that could quickly come to a halt, crushing their bodies between them. Mishaps also occurred when the job required the brakemen to run over ballast and railroad ties alongside the moving train. That is an encyclopedia describing a job that American men performed every day on every freight railroad in the country for decades. Life expectancy of less than 1 year. For a job, not a war, not a disease. A job that paid $1 a day and that could be made survivable by 2 machines that already existed. If your family worked the railroads, if your grandfather was a brakeman or a switchman or a yard conductor on a freight line in the 1870s or 1880s or 1890s, if there is a name in a lodge record of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen that you have always wondered about, if there is a headstone in a cemetery near a rail yard with a date that falls inside these decades, this is the machine that put it there. Subscribe if you want to see what I find next. The automatic coupler had been patented in 1873 by Eli Hamilton Janney, a man whose background had nothing to do with the railroad industry. Janney was born on November 12, 1831 in Loudoun County, Virginia. He served as a major in the Confederate Army during the Civil War on the staff of General Robert E. Lee. After the war, he became a dry goods clerk in Alexandria, Virginia, directly across the Potomac River from Washington, in a city that happened to be home to the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He was a skilled whittler. He carved his first coupler prototype out of wood at his dry goods counter, shaping 2 interlocking hooks that clasped together like the knuckles of a human hand. His design worked on a principle entirely different from the link and pin. Instead of a link and a pin and a man in the gap, Janney designed 2 identical knuckle mechanisms mounted on the drawhead of each car. When the cars were pushed together, the knuckles swung open on contact, interlocked, and locked automatically. No link was needed, no pin was needed, no man was required to stand between the cars. The coupling happened when the cars touched. A lever on the side of the car could unlock the knuckle from a safe position outside the gauge of the track. The brakeman never entered the gap at all. Janney received his first patent, United States Patent number 138,405, on April 29, 1873. The Master Car Builders Association, the industry body that set standards for railroad equipment, tested the design and approved it. The Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the largest and most progressive carriers in the country, began installing Janney-style knuckle couplers on its passenger equipment and its newest freight cars in the 1880s. Other major carriers followed. The technology was available. It was proven. It was being manufactured and sold by the Buckeye Steel Castings Company in Columbus, Ohio, and other foundries. The knuckle coupler worked. It eliminated the need for a man to stand between two moving freight cars. It saved fingers, it saved hands, it saved arms, it saved lives. And the vast majority of the American railroad fleet continued to operate with link and pin couplers. Replacing the couplers on every freight car in the country required removing the old link and pin pockets, which were bolted or riveted to the drawheads, and installing the new knuckle assemblies. The new assemblies required different mounting hardware and, in many cases, structural modifications to the car's frame. The cost per car was modest, but the American freight fleet in the early 1890s numbered over 1 million cars owned by hundreds of different railroads, and the collective cost of converting every car was enormous. The railroads argued that they could not bear the expense. They argued that the conversion would disrupt operations because cars with automatic couplers could not couple to cars with link and pin couplers without adapters, and during the transition period, the fleet would be a mix of both types, creating incompatibility in every yard and on every interchange. They argued that the market would eventually drive adoption without government interference, that the major carriers were already converting their newest stock, that mandating conversion was unnecessary government overreach into private enterprise. They argued, in short, that the cost was too high, while the brakemen argued with their hands and with the quarterly death journal that ran for pages. George Westinghouse had patented the air brake in 1869. Like Janney's coupler, the air brake eliminated one of the two most lethal tasks in the brakeman's job. Instead of a man running across the rooftops of a moving train in the dark and the rain to set each car's brake by hand, the Westinghouse air brake allowed the engineer to apply the brakes on every car in the train simultaneously from the locomotive cab by releasing compressed air through a continuous pipe running the length of the train. The technology worked, it was proven, it was available, and it was not required on freight trains until the same 1893 act that mandated the automatic coupler. The railroads had adopted air brakes on passenger trains years earlier because dead passengers made headlines and dead brakemen did not. The man who closed the gap was not a railroad worker or an engineer or a congressman. He was a farmer from Iowa. Lorenzo Stephen Coffin was born in Alton, New Hampshire on April 9, 1823. He attended Oberlin College in Ohio. He taught school, and one of his students was a boy named James Garfield, who would later become President of the United States. Coffin served as a minister during the Civil War from 1862 to 1863. After the war, he moved to Webster County, Iowa, where he farmed, bred livestock, edited the farm news section of the Fort Dodge Messenger, served on the board of the Iowa State Fair, helped establish the first farmers' mutual insurance companies, and built what is believed to be the first round barn in the state of Iowa in 1867. He had no connection to the railroad industry. In 1874, Lorenzo Coffin was standing near a railroad track somewhere in Iowa when he watched a brakeman coupling two freight cars. The brakeman was standing in the gap, holding the link and guiding it toward the approaching pocket. The timing was off. The cars came together. The brakeman pulled his hand out with 2 fingers gone and the blood running down his wrist, the coupling locked, and the train ready to move. Coffin watched it happen. He watched the man pull his hand out of the pocket and look at it and keep working, because that was the job and there was no one else to do it, and the train was not going to wait while a man bled. Coffin started talking to railroad men. He rode in cabooses with brakemen. He watched them work. He watched them couple. He watched them run the rooftops. He learned that what he had seen was not an anomaly. It was the daily reality of the job. 20 to 30,000 trainmen were maimed or killed every year across the American railroad system. He asked whether safer equipment existed. Yes. Janney's automatic coupler, Westinghouse's air brake, both patented, both tested, both proven, both available for purchase, neither required by any federal law. Coffin was 51 years old when he watched the brakeman lose his fingers. He spent the next 19 years of his life fighting to change the law. He became Iowa's first railroad commissioner in 1883. He used the position to promote railroad safety across the state. He drafted the first Railroad Safety Compliance Act in Iowa and saw it passed into state law. The railroads ignored it. A state law had no jurisdiction over interstate commerce, and virtually every railroad in the country operated across state lines. Coffin needed a federal law. He lobbied the Iowa legislature. He lobbied Congress directly. He traveled to Washington repeatedly at his own expense. He testified before congressional committees. He organized demonstrations. At one point, he arranged a public test of the Westinghouse air brake on the Burlington Railroad, inviting legislators and press to watch a train stop under air brakes instead of hand brakes. The demonstration was effective. The press coverage was favorable. The railroad lobby was stronger. The bill stalled. Coffin kept going. In 1889, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, both desperate for legislative action, enlisted Coffin to carry their case directly to Congress. He went. He testified again. He brought the numbers. He brought the names. He brought the death journals. He brought the hands. On March 2nd, 1893, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Safety Appliance Act into federal law. The act required all railroads operating in interstate commerce to equip their rolling stock with automatic couplers that could be operated without requiring a worker to go between the cars, and with AIR brakes that could be operated from the locomotive. The deadline for compliance was 7 years, meaning the full fleet had to be converted by 1900. It was the first major federal safety regulation in the history of the United States. It existed because a 51-year-old Iowa farmer saw a man lose 2 fingers and could not stop thinking about it for the rest of his life. The effect was immediate, measurable, and devastating in its implications for every year that the law had not existed. Between 1877 and 1887, approximately 38% of all railroad worker accidents involved coupling. That meant that more than a third of every injury and death on the American railroad system was caused by the link and pin coupler. By 1902, only 2 years after the Act's compliance deadline, coupling accidents had fallen to 4% of all employee accidents, from 38% to 4%. The number of coupler-related accidents dropped from nearly 11,000 per year in 1892 to just over 2,000 in 1902, even though the number of railroad employees had increased during the same decade. In the first full year after implementation, the overall casualty rate among trainmen dropped 60%. 60%. In 1 year. From one law, mandating one machine, that had existed for 20 years. The knuckle coupler did not require new technology. It did not require a scientific breakthrough. It did not require an invention that had not yet been made. It required the installation of a device that had been patented, tested, approved, manufactured, and commercially available since 1873. What it required was a law that said the railroads had to install it. Without the law, the railroads did the math. The couplers cost money. The brakemen were cheap. The brakemen's fingers were cheaper still. The math was the same math that appears in every story on this channel. The guard slows the line. The steel car costs more than the wooden car. The ventilation furnace consumes fuel. The geological survey takes time. The coupler conversion costs money. And the man who pays the price is the one standing in the gap with the link in one hand and the pin in the other, waiting for the drawheads to close, hoping that this is not the coupling where the timing is off and the iron takes what the iron takes. Eli Janney sold his patent rights to a Pittsburgh machinery firm before the full impact of his coupler was realized. He did not become wealthy from the device that bears his name and that saved more American lives than any single mechanical invention of the 19th century. The city of Alexandria, Virginia, where he had whittled his first wooden prototype at a dry goods counter while working as a store clerk after the war, named a street in his honor, Janney's Lane. That is his memorial. A street name in the town where a former Confederate major carved 2 wooden knuckles that clasped like hands and made it unnecessary for a man to stand between 2 railroad cars ever again. Lorenzo Coffin died on January the 17th, 1915, at the age of 91. He had spent 41 years, from the day he watched the brakemen in 1874 to the day he died, working for the safety of railroad men. His farm in Webster County, Iowa, was called Willow Edge. It is still there. The barn collapsed years ago. The fields have gone back to weeds and wildflowers, but his grave and the graves of his family beside it are well tended. They have been carefully fenced in and are maintained year after year by the railroad brotherhoods. The men whose union was founded in a caboose by 8 brakemen who could not buy insurance from anyone in the world take care of the grave of the Iowa farmer who watched a man lose 2 fingers and could not let it go. The knuckle coupler is still the standard coupling device on every railroad car in North America. The design has been refined, the metallurgy improved, the tolerance is tightened, but the principle is the same one that Eli Janney whittled out of a piece of wood in a dry goods store in Alexandria, Virginia in 1873. 2 knuckles that clasp like hands, no link, no pin, no man in the gap. Rolling stock manufactured in the early 1900s can still couple without modification to equipment built today over a century later. The standard held. The standard works. It has worked for 130 years, and for 20 of those years, between 1873 and 1893, the technology sat in a patent file while the link and pin coupler took fingers and hands and arms and lives at a rate that averaged 1 railroad worker dead every 3.5 hours around the clock in every switching yard in the country. I started with a yardmaster in a switching yard in the 1880s. A man walks up looking for work. He's new to the yard, but not new to the trade. The yardmaster does not ask where he has been or what he knows or how long he has been in the business. He says, "Hold up your hands." And the man holds up his hands, and the yardmaster looks at them. He counts what is missing. He sees the stumps where the fingers used to be, healed over, the skin smooth where the knuckle once bent. He sees the gap between the remaining fingers where another finger should be. And he knows. He knows the man has stood in the gap between 2 freight cars. He knows the man has held the link. He knows the man has dropped the pin. He knows the man has pulled his hands out just fast enough most of the time to keep the ones he still has. And he hires him. Because the fingers that are gone are the proof that the man survived the machine that the railroad chose not to replace, and surviving it was the only qualification that mattered. 20 years. The coupler existed. It clasped like 2 hands shaking. Nobody had to stand in the gap. It was patented in 1873. It was mandated in 1893. And in the 20 years between, the link and pin coupler took fingers and hands and arms and lives in every switching yard in the country at a rate that no insurance company would underwrite, and no brotherhood could afford to bury without pooling the wages of every living member. And the railroads did the math. And the math said the brakemen were cheaper than the couplers. America wasn't built in boardrooms. It was built in the dark, inside furnaces under 40-ton weights, and sometimes in the gap between 2 freight cars in a switching yard at midnight, where a man held an iron link in one hand and a pin in the other and waited for the drawheads to close with nothing between him and the iron but his timing and his grip and the fingers he still had. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how Carnegie's machine system made more steel than all of Britain and turned Pittsburgh black, that video is on screen now.